Rome did not fall in a single day. There was no one great battle after which the most powerful empire of the ancient world suddenly vanished. There was no moment when thousands of Romans woke up one morning and realized Rome is gone. It happened much more slowly. First came the loss of confidence, then came disorder. After that came fear, and only then did the barbarians appear at the gates. By the time the Germanic tribes began tearing the empire apart, Rome was already mortally wounded. And the most terrifying part was this: the Romans themselves had created the disease that destroyed their civilization. Once, Rome seemed eternal. Its roads crossed continents. Its armies inspired fear across the known world. Its laws governed millions of people from Britain to Egypt. The Romans called the Mediterranean Sea Mare Nostrum, our sea. To them, the world was divided into only two parts: Rome and everyone else. No civilization before it had ever reached such a scale. Legions built fortresses in the frozen forests of Germania, merchants carried silk from Asia, and massive cities shined with marble, gold, and statues of emperors. It seemed as if this system would last forever. But inside the great empire, a slow collapse had already begun. The first cracks did not appear at the borders. They appeared in the heart of Rome itself. By the 3rd century A.D., the empire had become too vast. Governing such enormous territories was becoming increasingly difficult. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. The army, once the protector of the state, gradually became a tool of political power. Now the legions were no longer fighting only Rome's enemies. They were fighting each other. Every successful general understood one thing: if the army supported him, he could become emperor. This transformed the empire into an endless struggle for the throne. Emperors were murdered by their own soldiers. Generals launched rebellions. Provinces broke away. Power changed hands at incredible speed. Sometimes a new emperor ruled for only a few months before being assassinated by conspirators. During the 3rd century alone, more than 20 emperors sat on the throne. Some died in battle, some were poisoned, others were torn apart by their own troops. Rome was slowly descending into chaos. But political assassinations were only part of the problem. The destruction of the economy proved far more dangerous. For centuries, Rome's wealth had been built on conquest. The empire constantly expanded: new territories, new slaves, new taxes, new resources. Victories fed the state. But eventually, expansion stopped. Rome had reached its limit. There were no more rich lands left to conquer easily. And without constant expansion, the system began to suffocate. Maintaining the massive army required enormous amounts of money. Cities needed grain. Officials demanded salaries. Borders had to be defended by larger and larger forces. The emperors responded by raising taxes. Ordinary people suffered the most. Farmers went bankrupt. Many abandoned their lands. Trade weakened. Prices rose. To hide the financial crisis, the government began debasing its currency. Cheap metals were mixed into silver coins. From the outside, the coins looked the same, but inside, they were nearly worthless. Inflation spread across the empire. People began losing faith in the economy. Some regions practically returned to barter systems. For a great empire, this was a disaster. While the economy weakened, society itself also began to decay. Once being Roman was considered a privilege. Rome provided protection, laws, roads, trade, stability. But over time, the people living in the provinces began to feel something very different. They saw corrupt officials, brutal tax collectors, elite power struggles, and endless civil wars. Rome no longer looked like a symbol of order. It began to look like the source of the problem. The situation became especially severe in rural regions. Many peasants could no longer pay taxes and fell under the control of wealthy landowners. Gradually, free citizens became something close to serfs. The empire was losing its middle class, the foundation of any stable civilization. The gap between the rich and the poor grew enormous. The elites continued living in luxury, marble villas, banquets, gold, slaves. Meanwhile, ordinary people increasingly faced hunger and poverty. Rome still looked magnificent from the outside, but inside it was slowly rotting. At the same time, danger was approaching the borders. To the north lived the Germanic tribes. For a long time, Rome viewed them as barbarians. But the world beyond the empire was changing. The tribes were becoming stronger, more organized, and more dangerous. Then the Huns arrived in Europe. Their arrival triggered a chain reaction. Fleeing from the Huns, Germanic peoples began moving toward Rome's borders in massive numbers. Thousands sought refuge inside the empire. Among them were the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Alans, the Suebi. Rome could no longer fully control the situation. Sometimes the barbarians were allowed in as allies. Sometimes Rome tried to stop them by force. But the crisis had become too large. The empire no longer possessed its former strength. Rome's weakness became painfully clear in 378 AD. At the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman army confronted the Goths. It was supposed to be another routine suppression of a barbarian uprising. Instead, it became a catastrophe. The Romans suffered a devastating defeat. Emperor Valens himself died on the battlefield. For contemporaries, the shock was enormous. For the first time in centuries, barbarians had destroyed a major Roman army together with an emperor. Many historians consider this battle the true beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. After Adrianople, one thing became clear: Rome was no longer invincible. In the following decades, the situation only worsened. The empire became increasingly dependent on Germanic mercenaries. The Roman army slowly stopped being truly Roman. Some barbarian commanders gained enormous influence within the state itself. In effect, Rome had begun outsourcing its own security to outsiders. It was incredibly dangerous, but there were few alternatives left. There was not enough money, not enough soldiers, not enough loyalty. Then, in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Goths, led by Alaric, entered Rome. The city that had once seemed untouchable was sacked. To people of the time, it felt like the end of the world. For nearly 800 years, foreign enemies had not captured Rome. And now the capital of the greatest empire on earth stood defenseless. Citizens fled through the streets in panic. Temples burned. The homes of wealthy families were looted. Screams echoed everywhere. The world was changing before their eyes. Although the Eastern Roman Empire still survived, psychologically, the damage was devastating. People began to realize eternal Rome was gone. But even after the sack, Rome continued to survive. The empire died slowly, almost painfully. Every decade became worse than the last. Provinces were lost one by one. Britain was effectively abandoned. North Africa, one of Rome's most important grain suppliers, was captured by the Vandals. Spain gradually slipped out of imperial control. The empire was shrinking. Money disappeared. The army weakened. Politicians continued their intrigues. And ordinary people simply tried to survive. By this time, many Romans had already lost faith in the state. Some cities preferred negotiating with barbarians instead of resisting them. In some cases, local populations even viewed the new rulers as the lesser evil. That was perhaps the most terrifying sign of collapse. The empire had not only lost territory, it had lost the belief of its own people. And without that, no state can survive. In 455 AD, Rome was sacked once again, this time by the Vandals. It was after this event that the word vandalism became associated with destruction. The city lost the last remnants of its former glory. Ancient buildings crumbled. The population declined. The economy nearly collapsed completely. Rome was becoming a shadow of itself. Then came the year 476, the traditional date marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Germanic commander Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, the young Romulus Augustulus. But there was no grand final battle, no apocalypse, no giant fire-consuming civilization overnight. It felt more like the final breath of a man who had been dying for a very long time. The empire had already nearly ceased to exist. 476 was only the symbolic ending. Yet the most remarkable thing is this: Rome never truly disappeared. Its ideas outlived the empire itself. Roman law shaped European civilization. Roman architecture continued inspiring the world. The Latin language became the foundation of many modern languages. Even thousands of years later, people still study Rome, admire it, and try to understand why it fell. Because the story of Rome is not simply the story of an ancient empire. It is the story of how great civilizations destroy themselves from within. Not in a single day, not through one enemy attack, but slowly, through corruption, through the greed of elites, through political chaos, through the collapse of public trust, through the internal decay of the system itself. And that is why the fall of Rome still feels terrifyingly modern, because no empire ever believes it will disappear until it does.